Welcome, everybody, to our 11 o'clock session. My name is Emma Donnelly. I will be moderating. Our session today is promoting belonging and equity in course content by Primrose Igonor from Marion Technical College. This session is being recorded for our colleagues who could not join us in real time. We are using automated Zoom captions during this live event, and we will edit the recording transcripts before we share them with you to be most accurate. At the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a closed caption button. You will see the live transcript text underneath that button. You can select turn them on or off as you prefer. Please pose your questions using the chat function, and I will be moderating throughout this session. Towards the end of the hour, we will share how we can continue the conversation of online and share some additional information with you. So now I'd like to hand the microphone over to our fantastic presenter, Primrose. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Unfortunately, I'm having issues with my video and you can't see me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to phone our IT department and hopefully somebody can come help me. But can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So welcome. I hope everybody's enjoying the conference thus far. My name is Primrose Igonor. I'm the director of the Connection Center at Marion Technical College. I also oversee belonging and equity. Can anybody guess where Marion Technical College is located?
Ohio.
Ohio, exactly. So in Marion, Ohio. So I'm going to give us an exercise to do, but before I do that, let me share my screen. There we go, Sarah. I wish I had candy. I would chuck candy at you right now, but unfortunately, we are online. So let me know if you can see the screen.
We can see it.
Awesome. So I'd like to start off with this exercise, a think, pair, share exercise. And I'd like to ask you, when did you first realize that you were different? When did you first realize that you were different? And you can either unmute yourself and respond to that prompt, or you can type in the chat. So I like students to first reflect, hence the think. And then once they've reflected and they have a response, I pair them up, which obviously we can't do today. And then for those that have the guts, I say, who would like to share? So let me give you a minute to do that while I contact my help desk. Okay, anybody want to share? Oh, there's a whole lot of messages. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Probably in elementary school, age 4. Deborah, we were together in a session earlier on. If you don't mind, do you want to share what you discovered about being different at that age, such a young age? Yes, absolutely. When I immigrated to the US, moving to a new school. Yes, Deborah.
Okay, sure. When I was that age, by that time I had taught myself how to read. And so when I was in preschool, I would, look for books that the teacher would read to us. And I would sneak in during playtime outside. I would sneak in and find a book she was reading to us, and I would read it myself, and I would read aloud to myself quietly in a corner. Well, when other kids found me doing that, they made fun of me, and they, and I had buck teeth on top of everything else. I looked like a beaver. And so I was bullied, from a very early age. And it didn't stop me from
Mhm.
doing what I wanted to do, but it was painful.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I'm reading more comments here. I was much shorter than the other kids. A lot of people, when they were very young, when I played baseball rather than softball, Tracy says for some reason that was weird. And I'm thinking maybe boys play baseball and girls play softball. So that was odd for a lot of people, right? First grade, fourth grade, and what have you. So I keep on putting stuff in chat. I have just brought in my help desk person to help with this. So I'm just going to mute myself while he works on this. Okay, while we work on this, I will go to my next prompt. And the question is, so you knew that you were different. So at such a young age, you realized the importance of belonging. Hence this presentation on how do we promote belonging in the classroom. So my next prompt is, why does diverse representation matter in the classroom? Why even do that? I like Emma's comment there, difference, Emma Gray, difference is observed through comparison, absolutely, right? So why would diverse representation matter in the classroom? I think to start with, we talk about the fact that it's so important to know our students' linguistic, cultural background, because when we know that, then we are intentional about including diverse materials in the classroom, right? And like Pam says, they absolutely, students feel comfortable, then they're ready to learn. They're motivated to learn, they're confident to learn. So the more we include in our content, the more they feel like they belong. And also the content becomes meaningful and relevant. Can you imagine studying something that doesn't have meaning for you personally, that is not relevant to you? So the more we can diversify our content, the more our students will be engaged. We also talk about, as you as an instructor, when you start to talk about yourself and what your background is. I mean, when we started this, Emma asked the question, if you feel comfortable, share in chat who you are, which college you're from, and what have you. And when we do that with our students, we then give them permission to do the same. I'm sure you can see from my accent that I'm not American, and students are always very intrigued by my accent. And if I just came in and taught and told them nothing about myself, then I wouldn't really be engaging them. Okay. Yes, somebody there puts to help students feel included. Yes, so that students belong, right? Also, when we have diverse representation, we allow students to display their different strengths. So let's say I'm teaching a course in psychology, and I have a student who immigrated from India, and I'm able to pose a question in class, what does psychology look like in India? And that student happens to know a response because they're from India, then they're going to be much more engaged in my class because I am focusing on their strengths. So we all have strengths and weaknesses, but when we have diverse representation, we can tap into literally every student's strength, which is what we want to do. And we have to remember that representation matters in terms of not just our content, but the visibility of role models who come from similar backgrounds as students do. I can't tell you how much my African students appreciate the fact that I am their instructor because I'm a fellow African. they will come to me after class and say, "Oh, you said you were from South Africa. Well, I'm from Ghana or I'm from Kenya," because they want us to connect at that level. So when we are able to show that to our students, that helps them feel like they belong. Of course, when students have the opportunity to see and hear from individuals who can serve as potential role models in their field of study, then of course they're encouraged to follow in the same path. So again, as a clinical psychologist, when students hear that I am a clinical psychologist and that's a path that they want to go into, they get very excited about that. So, who are your guest speakers? When you have guest speakers come to your class, can somebody write down in chat or please unmute yourself, guest speakers that are kind of more diverse than the norm? Who would those be? So who are your guest speakers? And unfortunately, we're unable to deal with a video issue, so we're just going to have to carry on using audio. Who are your guest speakers? Does anybody have somebody phenomenal that they brought that students would not even anticipate? Yeah, absolutely. Minorities, LGBTQ. And in that way, we give students a window into a world that they're not really aware of, right? Those representative of a population and other highly engaging individuals. Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely. The videos in your class, who is depicted in those videos? We tend to choose people that look like us, or we tend to choose the norm, in quotations, which tends to be white, heterosexual, Christian, right? So how do we go about intentionally diversifying who those people indicated individuals are in videos are? Yes, there we go, Kevin. I don't have guest speakers, but I share videos from diverse speakers. Absolutely. I had a guest speaker from Afghanistan. He spoke about his life and going to college to be an English teacher. Emma, that is fantastic, right? Because again, this gives our students a view into the world that they might not know, or they might be a student of Afghani descent, and that connection there is huge. It also helps to see the other as an individual. You're right, Amelie, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that's why we talk about belonging. So we want to include a variety of scholarship and voices. It's also very important to acknowledge imbalances in the field. So as a clinical psychologist who studied in South Africa, I studied psychology from a Western perspective in South Africa, which is in Africa. Where were the Black people? Where were the women in psychology, right? It was always about Freud, Piaget, Erickson. Those are big names in psychology. And didn't really realize, oh, there's also women in psychology. There's also Black people in psychology. So we want to be able to talk to our students about that. Do some digging to find ignored scholars. So again, you have to be intentional about this. How many of you watched Hidden Figures, the movie Hidden Figures? Yes. How many of you knew that there was Black women in NASA? I had absolutely no idea, right? So as a woman, as a Black woman watching that with my Black sons, with my Black husband, that did us proud, right? So think about that. It's so easy to look at the world from your perspective, from the lens through which you look at the world. You have to be intentional about going outside of that way of thinking. So we want to convey to students that they have a place in their field of study as well as in the classroom, right? So we want to contextualize the learning. When we do that, the analogies that we use in the classroom are actually absorbed and organized in the brain because this is meaningful, it's relevant, it makes sense to me, so I'm engaged and I'm actually going to remember. I also think this allows us to validate different ways of knowing. And when I say different ways of knowing, I'm actually talking about indigenous ways of knowing. As a South African, we are proud of our philosophy of Ubuntu. Who has heard that term before, Ubuntu? Which really relates to this whole topic of promoting a sense of belonging. Nobody. So Ubuntu means humanity towards others. Giovanna says, yes, I'm African. Virasami, okay, yes. I wonder if are you South African? Because if you're South African, I'd ask, are you from Natal? Mauritian, awesome. Oh my goodness, that's fantastic. But Ubuntu means humanity towards others. I am because you are. You cannot exist without me, and I cannot exist without you. So if we have and embrace that whole philosophy and we use that in our classrooms to say, I cannot be a good teacher without you, my student. How many of you learn from your students? I learn something every single semester, right? So we want to validate different ways of knowing when we talk about these. Yes, all the time, every day. So a sense of belonging is critical to learning. Feeling this will either hinder or allow students to succeed. If I don't feel like I belong, I might not succeed. But if I feel like I belong, I am understood, I am accepted, even when I have challenges, I will feel comfortable enough to go to my peers, to my teacher, whatever the case might be, and actually say, I need help, right? Yes, Kevin, I tell my students that we all learn from each other. I love that. The other thing I wanted to talk about in relation to that slide was the whole notion of cultural capital. I had never heard that term. We all know what social capital is, right? If I know how to network, if I know how to talk the talk, then I'm more likely to get the job that I want. Cultural capital occurs when students see themselves in the curriculum, the readings, the class examples, the videos. So the more cultural capital they have, the more they can interact. Yes, Emma, my slides are not up because I'm just talking about the previous one, right? Okay, so my next prompt then, and I'll go back to sharing my screen. What happened to it? I've really had issues with, yeah, I was able to share it earlier for some reason now. Apologies, my apologies. Trying to figure out what, okay. So let's move on to my next slide, or my next prompt, which is how then do we actually diversify our course content? What do we actually do? And there's three things that I want to talk about and hopefully get some input from you. How do we diversify course content? Number one, topics addressed. What topics are you addressing in your class? Which ones do you choose to focus on? So, as an example, when I used to teach a sociology course, there was a chapter on socioeconomic status. And because I teach in Marion, Ohio, which is typically about 98% white and typically has first generation students. Now, before I moved to the States 7 years ago, I had never heard of the term first generation students, especially not in terms of white students. I just assumed that people that were facing challenges in terms of education and what have you were mainly people of color. So, as a Black woman moving to the States with its history, I said, well, I might encounter racism, but at least when it comes to socioeconomic status, I'm middle class. I'm going to be teaching white students and they're middle class, so at least we have a way to bond. So imagine my shock when I came into the classroom and I realized very quickly that what I was talking about, the examples that I was using, seemed to be going over the top of my students' heads. And eventually I learned that a lot of them were first generation students, first in their family to come to college. So they didn't have that social capital as it relates to education. They didn't have parents that they could go home to and have discussions with because their parents had never been to university, they had never been to college. So, in that chapter on socioeconomic status, I chose to focus on poverty in much more detail because that was something that was very evident amongst a lot of my students. And because of that, I wanted to bust myths about poverty, such as poor people are lazy, or that whole notion of welfare queens. Because in order for my students to feel they belong, if we're talking about poverty, I wanted them to understand what poverty really is and not be ashamed of it, right? I'm going to look here. Curriculum globalization will help you diversify. CC. Giovanna, what is CC? And Tamina, unfortunately, I'm having issues with my computer. That's why you're not able to see me or my slides. Oh, there we go. Kevin responded to that. Using real world examples from a variety of cultures. Absolutely. Thank you, Brianne. Brett says, I give students some choice on topics. Yes. Giving them choice, giving them voice, makes them feel like they belong. I love that. Asking students for feedback, right? Yes, Amy, even those of us who are being intentional about diversity can have blind spots. Me as a black person can have blind spots when it comes to race. Yes, absolutely. Okay, good. The other thing we do when we are diversifying course content, I don't know if anybody mentioned this, but the examples that you use. I remember, yes, there we go, Brianne. So in my notes, you could be doing this presentation. I said, yes, examples. Do examples portray individuals from a particular identity group, i.e., are they all only heterosexual? Are they all married? Are they all Christian? Are they all in stereotypical occupations or situations? However, when bringing in diverse perspectives, be careful to avoid tokenizing marginalized perspectives, but only including some here or there. Strive to make a multiplicity of viewpoints central to the course. Okay, so you want to be intentional. Mix things up. For example, talk about Jim and John are married, or Ali and Halima have two children. That's how we expose our students to diversity. So you might be thinking, okay, she works in Marion. Honestly, how many Muslim students does she have? Believe it or not, we actually have a few. But let's say there was none. What would that do for white students? Me talking about Ali and Halima, or let's say non-Christian students. What would that do for heterosexual students when I refer to Jim and John? Any comments? Type, unmute yourself. You don't even have to come on video, just talk to me. Amelie, listen, the danger of a single story, if you haven't seen that, you have to see that. That's by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Yes, spot on, right? Spot on. And then the other way you can diversify your course content is looking at the readings that you assign. If most of the readings present dominant perspectives, find ways to open up the curriculum to include multiple perspectives, including ones that are usually marginalized. So, in an English course, instead of focusing solely on Shakespeare, how about talking about Toni Morrison's work? Okay, and nobody answered my question. What does that do for white students? It opens their minds to other ways of being, other ways of knowing. Because that same white student might end up in a global company. And if they haven't been exposed to difference, they might have a real challenge, right? Yes, Giovanna says it decenters them, right? Decenters them so that they can know other ways of being. And so when you do all of this, you are incorporating more diverse voices within the classroom. Those voices that you include convey messages about who belongs within a field of study, who has legitimacy when speaking about certain subject matters, and how knowledge is produced and what knowledge matters. So if Toni Morrison is discussed in my English class, then I say as a student, oh, so Black women have a place in literature because we learned about her. And so the next time you meet a Black woman in literature, you're going to think back to, hey, we studied Toni Morrison. I better listen here, right? Anita says, not my learned yesterday from a history teacher. I'm not quite understanding your comment. Do you mind explaining it in more detail, Anita? Learned yesterday from a history teacher comparing articles about the California missions from the perspective.
The, the
Go ahead.
message, hi. The message was that when reading articles written from the perspective of those who were enslaved, the development of the 21 missions in California was not all that spectacular. What we're taught in our history is that this is the best thing that's ever happened to California, but it wasn't equally well received by everyone.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right. And without going to, okay, can you unmute yourself? I think I'm echoing. Without going into the whole CRT debate, critical history and all that, it's going to take time. We have to introduce slowly but surely. We can't ram it down people's throats. This is my personal opinion. People have been thinking about this in a certain way for such a long time. And I think it's so important to build relationships if you want to make these changes. You have to build relationships so that people that you're trying to change or help change their mindset trust you enough to go along with you. Michelle Harper, I had seen you pop up on video. Did you want to share something?
No, I was just joining. I joined late, so I'm
Oh.
not even sure where I'm at. I was waiting for
Oh.
the 12 o'clock one, so sorry.
Okay, no worries. Emma, I like that. Yes, no other ways of being. So that's what I talked about earlier. Validate other ways of being, other ways of knowing, right? And I like that term, generations of consciousness. And maybe if we have time at the end, I'd love for you to explain that in more detail. So I've kind of talked about psychology, sociology. Let's be honest. How do we diversify, in quotations, neutral courses? What do you think I mean by neutral courses? Accounting, chemistry, science, right? It's all about theories. How am I going to diversify that? Any ideas? How many of you are teaching those supposedly called neutral courses? And if so, maybe just put there in chat. Give me a neutral course that somebody's teaching. Maybe we can walk through that one. For instance, anybody teaching math? Giovanna, did you want to say something?
Yes, I did. It is possible to, thank you for giving me a chance to speak. It is possible to diversify neutral courses by bringing in, for example, if you're teaching math, you decenter it from European mathematicians and bring in mathematicians, work from mathematicians in other parts of the world. For example, Ramanujan in India, or if you're teaching astronomy, you teach your students that you don't pronounce that star up there as Betelgeuse, but Bet Algurs, and talk about the contributions made by people that in the modern Middle Eastern region, and their contributions to astronomy, for example.
Absolutely, thank you. That's a perfect answer, right? We have math faculty here. Two of them are white, and one is Chinese. And the one white man always talks about the fact that math was actually developed by brown people. If you think about Egypt, so you can talk about that in class as a start. But I wanted to just share this story that came up. They say, beware of instances where non-neutral course content finds you. There's a story of a math instructor who was teaching a class, and a student made a throwaway comment that irrational numbers must all be female. Irrational numbers must all be female. Can you imagine the pandemonium that ensued after that? And I bet it was, of course, it must have been a male student. And how unprepared the instructor felt, because he had always thought, I don't need to prepare myself for any kind of diversity. I'm just teaching math. and numbers, so they're not controversial. But this male student said irrational numbers because they don't make sense, because they're strange, they're weird, they must be female. So I can imagine how those female students, that probably ended the class right there and then. And the teacher, because he was not prepared, was not able to deal with the issue that happened. So we always have to kind of be careful about that. Talk about, this kind of relates to what Giovanna said, talk about the barriers to inclusion in terms of course content. So yes, we're learning math and we're talking about Einstein, but hey, let's talk about so and so. In fact, Giovanna, the first name that you mentioned, I think it was East Indian mathematician, the name that starts with a V. Can you pronounce that again? I watched a movie about him.
I put it in
What's
the
that?
chat.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Yeah. So my son absolutely loves math. That's his favorite movie. So we saw this on Netflix and we're like, oh, you like math? Let's watch it. And boy, did he learn a lot because this man was from the continent of India. He died too soon. He ended up actually at Oxford University, probably the topmost university in the world. And students need to know about him, right? So in math, you can do that. So it's very important to talk about those barriers that you see. Going back to the example of hidden figures, those in a math class, we can talk about the black females who were involved in NASA and doing those mathematics equations. Okay. And as I tell my students constantly, all knowledge is contestable. I encourage students to think in that way. So yes, we're learning about Freud, who practiced in, I think it was Vienna, Austria, or Germany. Who else practiced as a psychologist in China? Go and look up that information. Or let's make sure that although it's not in the textbook, I am going to go and be intentional about getting a reading, and we're going to have a discussion on that. Another way is to also include diverse student voices by including small group work. When we put our students in small groups, especially groups that are diverse, they get to hear from one another information that they might not have had before, right? So let's say we are doing something in English and we're going to discuss our favorite author. And everybody goes for the typical people, and somebody comes in and says, actually, do you all know like the danger of a single story, Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi? Have you listened to her TED talk? You guys, you need to listen to this. This is how we help our students learn more and more. So it's one thing as a teacher, as a professor, to be able to diversify your course content, to be intentional about it. But how do we help our students engage with diverse materials? We can't assume that they know. Think about me in a predominantly white college, rural America. How do I just assume my students know about diversity, right? So I have to also be willing to help my students engage with diverse materials. So one important way is to model to students how to do so, right? In a respectful manner. You can also encourage pushback. You can model intellectual debate and standards of evidence, right? So in pushback, you are teaching your students how to disagree in the classroom. So we're not at a football stadium where we're going to punch each other. No, we're actually in a classroom. We have to have respect for one another, and this is how we do it. Address problematic statements in the moment. Many people are like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't know what to do, so I let it go. No. You have to expect, especially if we think about America today, you have to expect that there is going to be an issue. And so you have to prepare yourself for that. You have to start thinking, if this was to happen, how would I deal with it? If you sweep it under the carpet, what does that do for the student that was maybe insulted? You know, somebody said something negative about Latinx students, and I have one in the classroom. and oh my goodness, I don't want to get involved in this. Okay, class, we're done, we're done. What does that do for that Latinx student, right? So you have to be prepared to do that. So don't think if such and such happens, for example, someone uses a racial slur, rather think when this happens in my classroom, because at some point it is going to happen and you want to be prepared. Many times I will say, I'm uncomfortable. I don't feel comfortable with what you just said. And maybe you can say it a different way, but be open and honest about that. Use humor. I love humor. Go to a movie with a friend and they say, oh, that movie was so gay. Oh, would you have preferred a straight movie? Right? So we laugh about it, but I think the message gets there. Be literal and refuse to rely on assumptions being made. Uh, you say that the movie was so gay. So what do you mean by that? When you say a movie is gay, I actually want you to explain it to me. I don't want to assume that I know what you mean. So you want to be literal. Ask questions which invite discussion. So again, the way you do it, the way you pose your questions, all those things matter. Yes, Emma, it shows you don't care and you don't see or value them. Use direct communication. I statements. I think you've all heard of I statements. When you put yourself as a central person, people are more likely to respond to what it is you have to say. Joy, okay, I thought you had unmuted yourself, but I see now that you're muted again. Okay, so uh, students, we have to remember, often struggle when they encounter challenges to their own ways of knowing. You think about it yourself. I look at the world through this lens and somebody's trying to make me change. We are the adults. We are the ones learning about diversity. We're the ones doing the reflection. So it's easier for us. Initially, it's difficult, but eventually, I think for us generally, that's why here in this session, it becomes easier. But for our students, we're not saying to them, hey, you're going to be the professor, the teacher for this course. And so you got, no. They just come in with this way of thinking. And how are you going to help them diversify that way of thinking? A lot relies on how you present the material. Another thing to include there is consider using a framework of intercultural competence. A really good one that I've always used is the AAC and U one. Oh, okay. I'm just trying to type it in here. AAC and U. Has everybody heard of AAC and U? Okay, they have conferences, but they have an intercultural, a rubric that helps look at intercultural competence. Yes, I see some people do. So this rubric identifies the knowledge, skills, and attitudes individuals must develop, including cultural self-awareness, empathy, openness, all those type of things. So when you give an assignment, you could use that rubric to see where students are in their path to becoming more reflective when it comes to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So you can use that. And then very importantly, you want to communicate a caring teaching philosophy. Yes, you say the wrong thing, but I still care about you, and together we're going to learn to do better. When students make mistakes, we don't want to punish them. We don't want to make them feel embarrassed, guilty, whatever it is. We want to show them that we care and we can all grow together. I think that's very important. Thank you for putting that link there, Emma. How many people use rubrics like that? Diversity rubrics or elements from that rubric in their assignments and what have you. Oh my goodness. And I see we're running out of time. Okay, so let us go to this slide. How do you become an inclusive instructor? This is kind of a summary. Number one, selection. Remember that it helps to have some background information about your students before selecting your course materials. Over here, we use Power School. In Power School, you can find out somebody's ethnicity, their race, their gender, their age. And so as you prepare your materials, oh, I have a lot of high school students, but I also have older students. So I need to balance the information that I'm giving to my class. Student interactions, very important. Make students feel welcome and that they belong by selecting content that represents their experiences. And then it's so important to be intentional about designing for inclusion. Okay, don't just be haphazard or infuse belonging and equity in your course content by using what we call the drop-in and stir method. You actually have to be intentional. Which readings am I going to have? Who are my guest speakers going to be? Right from the get-go. And this is very important. How do we engage in self-reflection on an ongoing basis? This is my last slide. So I'd love to hear from people. How do you engage in self-reflection when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Absolutely, by participating in discussions like this. Thank you, right? You want to always be practicing actively how to disrupt your own biases in your beliefs and behaviors. It's a continual game. Yes, Emma, we will definitely have those slides. It's ongoing work which requires reading more, attending workshops like this, learning more about different experiences, and incorporating this information into your teaching. Constantly do the awkward, uncomfortable, and sometimes painful work of unpacking your biases and the ways these inform your teaching. So I talked earlier about first generation students and how I had to change the way I was delivering information, right? I like that. Brett says anonymous poll of students reflect on what they share. Yes. Okay. I use pronouns. In fact, when I introduced myself because of this computer issue, I forgot to say my name is Primrose Igonor and my pronouns are she, her, hers. That allows for students to then identify their own pronouns. Try and include a statement about that maybe in your syllabus, because that is going to, again, help students know that they belong in your classroom. So in summary, inclusive teaching allows students to be engaged in equitable learning environments and feel a sense of belonging. We can achieve this by being responsive to the diversity of our class and designing learning environments that include all of our students. Okay, Emily says, I continue to tweak my assignments. Wonderful. That takes work, right? Every semester I'm going back to I want to make it better, but you're doing it. I love that. Amy says, having conversations with other faculty at the university. Yes. Your peers, right? Many times you have the same people teaching the same course. Get together and talk about, hey, what are you doing in terms of DEI? And copy. Share what you're doing. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we have 2 more minutes. Are there any pressing questions? Although I know it's just 2 more minutes. Thank you so much for your attention. So sorry about the video, the slides, technology. But I will definitely share these with you, Emma. I will.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Thank you, everybody. Shannon, Pam.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this because I'm used to seeing my presentations, right? And watching videos and watching lectures, but this really helped me listen at a deep, deep level. So I actually enjoyed this challenge and I learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. I'll see everybody in the next session.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. All right, if you want to reach us on social media, I posted many, many links in the chat box for Peralta Online Equity. Thank you so much for joining this session, and I hope you continue to attend all of our other sessions we have today and tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a great day.